My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for 17 years of my life, I was legally dead while walking among the living. My own mother orchestrated this elaborate deception, convincing everyone from neighbors to government officials that her youngest daughter had perished in a tragic accident. The truth? She needed me gone on paper so she could continue collecting the monthly child support payments that were supposed to ensure my survival and education. At 34 years old, I've spent more than half my life trying to understand how a woman who gave birth to me could erase my existence so completely, so methodically, and with such chilling calculation. This isn't just a story about financial fraud or family dysfunction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is about what happens when someone who should protect you becomes the architect of your disappearance, and how I clawed my way back from the dead to reclaim not just my identity, but my entire life. The first time I truly understood that something was fundamentally wrong with my existence, I was standing in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles on my 16th birthday, clutching the birth certificate my mother had given me with trembling hands. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, typed my information into her computer system with practiced efficiency. Then she stopped, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as her expression shifted from routine boredom to confusion. She cleared her throat and looked up at me with genuine concern. "Honey, there seems to be some kind of error in the system. According to our records, someone with your name and social security number was reported deceased 3 years ago." Her voice was gentle, as if she were delivering news of a recent tragedy rather than informing me that I was apparently a ghost standing before her. I felt my world tilt slightly off its axis. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, and the mundane sounds of the DMV, conversations, shuffling papers, the mechanical whir of photo equipment, all faded into a distant hum. "That can't be right," I managed to whisper, my voice sounding strange and far away even to my own ears. "I'm obviously standing right here." The clerk's sympathy was palpable as she turned her computer screen toward me, revealing an official death certificate filed in my name. The date of death was listed as March 15, 3 years prior. The cause was listed as complications from a car accident. The person who had filed the certificate was listed as my mother, Carmen Rodriguez, reporting the death of her minor daughter. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the information as if it might change if I looked long enough. My legs felt unsteady, and I gripped the counter to keep myself upright. The teenager behind me in line sighed audibly, clearly annoyed by the delay, completely unaware that they were witnessing someone discover their own supposed death. "What does this mean?" I asked the clerk, though part of me already knew the answer would shatter everything I thought I understood about my life. She explained, with the patience of someone who had likely encountered bureaucratic nightmares before, though probably nothing quite like this, that I would need to contact the Social Security Administration to resolve the discrepancy. She printed out copies of the documents for me, handling them with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for evidence in a criminal investigation. Walking to my mother's car in the parking lot, I felt like I was moving through thick water. Every step required enormous effort, and my mind raced with questions I didn't know how to ask. Carmen was waiting behind the wheel, engine running, wearing the same slightly impatient expression she always wore when forced to deal with what she considered bureaucratic inconvenience. "Got your license?" she asked. Without looking up from her phone, where she was scrolling through social media with the absorbed attention of someone checking stock prices. "Mom," I began, my voice shaky. "The DMV says I'm dead." For just a moment, the briefest fraction of a second, her fingers stopped moving across her phone screen. It was such a subtle pause that if I hadn't been watching her carefully, studying her face with the intense focus of someone seeking answers, I might have missed it entirely. Then she looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine confusion, though I would later recognize it as a masterfully performed expression. "What are you talking about, Isabella? That's ridiculous." Her tone was dismissive, the same one she used when I complained about household chores or asked for money for school activities. "These government computers are always messing up. We'll get it sorted out." But something in her response felt rehearsed, too smooth, too lacking in the kind of shock and outrage I would have expected from a mother learning that her daughter had been erroneously declared dead. Most parents would have been furious, demanding immediate answers, threatening to call supervisors or lawyers. Carmen simply started the car and began driving home as if I had informed her of a minor scheduling conflict. During the silent drive back to our small apartment in the Riverside district of our mid-sized California city, I studied the woman who had raised me, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in years. Carmen Rodriguez was 41 years old, a woman who had learned to navigate the world with careful calculation. She had thick black hair that she kept meticulously styled, dark eyes that could shift from warm to cold in an instant, and a smile that she deployed strategically rather than spontaneously. She worked as a receptionist at a medical billing company, a job that required her to be pleasant and efficient while dealing with insurance companies and frustrated patients. At home, she was different, more guarded, always seeming to be listening for something, watching for threats that weren't immediately apparent to me. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment that she kept obsessively clean and organized. Every surface was free of clutter, every piece of mail was filed immediately, and she maintained detailed records of household expenses in a series of notebooks that she updated religiously every evening. I had always attributed this attention to detail to her work requirements, but now I began to wonder if there were other motivations behind her meticulous record-keeping. My older brother Miguel was 22 and had moved out when he turned 18, enlisting in the army partly to escape what he had once described to me as Mom's weird control issues. He called sporadically and visited even less frequently, always seeming uncomfortable during the brief times he spent in our apartment. When I was younger, I had assumed his distance was typical sibling behavior, the natural progression of growing up and moving on with life. My older sister Elena was 19 and attending community college while working part-time at a local retail store. She still lived at home, but spent most of her time either at school, work, or with her boyfriend Marcus, a relationship that Carmen barely tolerated. Elena had always been the rebellious one in our family, pushing boundaries and questioning rules in ways that seemed to genuinely distress our mother. Then there was me, the youngest, the one who had always been the most compliant, the most eager to please, the one who followed rules without question and sought approval through good behavior. I had been a straight-A student throughout elementary and middle school, participated in student government, volunteered at local charity events, and generally tried to be everything I thought a good daughter should be. But as I sat in that passenger seat, staring out the window at familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, I began to understand that my position as the good daughter might have made me the perfect candidate for whatever scheme my mother had orchestrated. I was the child least likely to question authority, least likely to dig too deeply into inconsistencies, least likely to cause problems that might expose uncomfortable truths. That evening, I attempted to research the process for correcting death records, using the family computer in our shared living space. Carmen seemed unusually interested in my online activities, hovering near the computer desk and asking repeated questions about what I was looking for. When I explained that I was trying to understand how to fix the error, she became increasingly agitated. "Why are you making such a big deal about this?" she demanded, her voice taking on an edge I rarely heard. "I told you we'll handle it. These things take time to resolve. You can't just expect government agencies to fix their mistakes overnight." Her insistence that I stop researching struck me as odd. Most parents would encourage their child to be proactive about resolving such a significant problem. But Carmen seemed almost desperate to prevent me from learning too much about the process, redirecting my attention to homework assignments and household responsibilities whenever I brought up the subject. Over the next few days, I noticed other peculiarities in our household that I had previously dismissed as quirks or practical considerations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
We had never had what most families would consider normal documentation. Carmen handled all official paperwork, from school enrollment to medical appointments, and I had never been encouraged to take responsibility for my own administrative needs. When friends' families went on vacations that required passports or plane tickets, Carmen always had elaborate explanations for why we couldn't afford such trips or why they weren't worth the hassle. When classmates discussed getting after-school jobs, she insisted that my studies were too important to compromise with employment, even though our family clearly struggled financially. Most significantly, I began to realize that I had very few photographs of myself before the age of 13. When I asked about baby pictures or early childhood memories, Carmen became evasive, claiming that most of our family photos had been lost in a move or damaged in a flood that had supposedly affected our previous apartment. The more I observed these patterns, the more questions arose in my mind. Why had we moved so frequently during my early childhood? Why did Carmen seem nervous whenever census workers or government surveyors came to our door? Why did she always insist on handling all communication with my school's administrative office? I started paying closer attention to the mail that arrived at our apartment. Carmen was always the first to collect it, sorting through envelopes with careful attention before I had a chance to see what had arrived. When I asked about bills or official correspondence, she provided vague answers about adult responsibilities and financial matters that were too complicated for me to understand. One afternoon, while Carmen was at work and Elena was at school, I decided to search through some of the filing cabinets where she kept household documents. I told myself I was just looking for my social security card or birth certificate, documents I would need to resolve the DMV situation. What I found instead was a collection of papers that made no sense in the context of the life I thought I had been living. Hidden in a folder marked medical records were several official-looking documents that referenced government assistance programs I had never heard my mother mention. There were forms related to survivor benefits, correspondence with Social Security Administration offices, and most confusingly, records of monthly payments that seemed to correspond to child support. Despite the fact that Carmen had always told me that my father had abandoned our family when I was very young and had never provided any financial support. The amounts listed on these documents were not insignificant. They represented hundreds of dollars every month, money that should have been available for household expenses, education costs, and family needs. Yet Carmen had always insisted that we lived paycheck to paycheck, that luxuries were impossible, that I needed to be grateful for the basic necessities she managed to provide. As I studied these papers, trying to understand their implications, I heard the sound of keys in the front door lock. Carmen was returning from work earlier than expected, and I had barely enough time to return the documents to their original positions and close the filing cabinet before she entered the apartment. "What are you doing home so early?" she asked, her tone immediately suspicious as she noticed me standing near the filing cabinets. "I had a half day at school," I replied, which was true, though I didn't mention that I had used the extra time to investigate our household documents. She studied my face carefully, searching for signs of deception or misbehavior. Carmen had always been skilled at reading people's expressions, a talent she used to great effect in her work and personal relationships. But I had learned some of those same skills from watching her, and I managed to keep my expression neutral and innocent. "Have you heard anything more about that DMV situation?" she asked, her tone suggesting that she hoped the answer would be no. "Not yet," I said. "I'm still waiting for them to call back about the next steps." What I didn't tell her was that I had called the Social Security Administration that morning from a payphone at school, using change I had saved from lunch money over several weeks. The conversation with the government representative had been brief but illuminating. They had confirmed that someone with my name and Social Security number had indeed been reported deceased 3 years earlier, and that survivor benefits had been issued to my mother as the surviving parent of a minor child. The representative had explained that correcting such an error would require extensive documentation and potentially involve investigations into how the false death report had been filed. They had asked several questions about my current living situation and whether I had any reason to believe the death report might have been filed fraudulently. I had not answered that question directly, claiming I needed to gather more information before proceeding. But the seed of suspicion that had been planted at the DMV was growing into something larger and more frightening. The pieces of evidence I was discovering all pointed toward the same impossible conclusion that my mother had deliberately reported my death in order to collect benefits meant to support the child she had erased from official existence. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of what I was beginning to understand. If my suspicions were correct, then everything about my life for the past 3 years had been built on a foundation of fraud and deception. The monthly checks that Carmen received were meant to help raise a child who was supposedly dead, while that same child lived in the same household, unaware that her existence had been officially terminated. But why would a mother do such a thing? What circumstances could drive someone to essentially kill their own child on paper while continuing to house and feed them in reality? And perhaps most importantly, what was my life supposed to look like now that I was beginning to understand the truth? I thought about my siblings, Miguel and Elena, and wondered if they knew anything about this situation. Miguel had left home right after graduating high school, citing a need for independence and adventure. But now I wondered if his departure had been motivated by knowledge of our family's dark secret, a need to distance himself from whatever Carmen was involved in. Elena, who was only 3 years older than me, would have been 16 when I was supposedly killed in the car accident. Surely she would remember if her sister had actually died. Yet she had never mentioned anything about my death or resurrection, never treated me as anything other than her annoying younger sibling, who occasionally borrowed her clothes without permission. The more I considered the logistics of what my mother had apparently accomplished, the more impressed and terrified I became. She had managed to maintain a household that included a daughter who was legally dead, enrolled that daughter in school, provided medical care when necessary, and created the appearance of a normal family life, all while collecting monthly payments meant to compensate for the loss of that same daughter. It required careful planning, consistent deception, and the ability to compartmentalize in ways that suggested either extraordinary criminal talent or significant psychological detachment. Carmen had managed to be both the grieving mother receiving survivor benefits and the active parent raising the supposedly deceased child, switching between these roles as circumstances required. As I drifted toward sleep that night, I realized that my entire understanding of my mother, my family, and my place in the world had fundamentally shifted. The woman who had raised me was not just secretive or controlling, she was operating an elaborate fraud that required my ignorance to succeed. I was not just the youngest daughter in a struggling single-parent household, I was an invisible person whose official existence had been traded for monthly government checks. The question that haunted me as I finally fell asleep was not just how this had happened, but what it meant for my future. How do you build a life when you don't legally exist? How do you plan for college, career, marriage, or any of the normal milestones of adulthood when you are officially dead? And most pressingly, what happens when the person who has stolen your identity realizes that you have discovered their secret? Over the following weeks, I began to understand that I was living in a precarious situation that could collapse at any moment. Carmen's fraud depended on my continued ignorance and cooperation, but it also depended on maintaining the illusion that I was dead to anyone who might investigate the survivor benefits she was receiving. This meant that my movements, my activities, my very existence had to be carefully managed to avoid detection. I began to understand why Carmen had always been so controlling about my social activities, why she discouraged friendships that might lead to overnight visits or family gatherings, why she was always nervous about official paperwork or unexpected visitors. I was not just her daughter, I was her accomplice, whether I knew it or not. Every day that I continued to live in her household while remaining officially dead was another day of active participation in her fraud. The teenager who had always prided herself on being honest and law-abiding was discovering that she had been unknowingly complicit in a federal crime for years. The weight of this knowledge was enormous, pressing down on my chest like a physical burden that made it difficult to breathe. I found myself looking at my mother differently, studying her expressions and mannerisms for clues about her true motivations and feelings. Was she proud of her elaborate deception, or was she trapped by circumstances beyond her control? Did she feel guilt about what she had done to me, or had she rationalized her actions as necessary for our family's survival? Most disturbing was the realization that Carmen had been watching me carefully throughout this entire charade, monitoring my development and behavior to ensure that I didn't accidentally expose her secret. Every conversation we had about my future, every discussion of plans and dreams, was filtered through her need to maintain the fiction of my death. When I talked about wanting to attend college, she discouraged expensive schools and suggested community college options that would allow me to live at home. When I mentioned wanting to travel or study abroad, she found reasons why such plans were impractical or dangerous. When I showed interest in part-time jobs that might lead to financial independence, she emphasized the importance of focusing on academics instead. I had always interpreted these responses as the natural protectiveness of a single mother managing limited resources. Now I understood that they were strategic maneuvers, designed to keep me dependent and hidden, ensuring that I remained within the controlled environment where my non-existence could be maintained. The psychological impact of this discovery was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I felt simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, erased and exposed, protected and endangered. The identity I had spent 16 years developing felt suddenly fragile and false, built on foundations that could be swept away by a phone call to the wrong government office. But alongside the fear and confusion, I began to feel something else, a cold, clear anger that started as a small flame and grew steadily stronger each day. Carmen had stolen more than just government money. She had stolen my future, my possibilities, my right to exist as a full person in the world. She had made me a ghost in my own life, dependent on her continued deception for everything from basic identification to the possibility of higher education. The woman who should have been my advocate and protector had instead become the architect of my invisibility, trading my legitimate existence for monthly payments that she apparently felt entitled to receive. And she had done it all while maintaining the facade of a loving, struggling single mother doing her best to raise 3 children under difficult circumstances. As I lay in bed each night, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the enormity of what I was learning, I began to understand that I had a choice to make. I could continue living as a ghost, dependent on Carmen's carefully maintained deception, accepting the limitations and risks that came with being officially dead. Or I could find a way to resurrect myself, to reclaim my legal existence and build a life based on truth rather than fraud. Neither option was simple or safe. Remaining dead meant accepting a permanently constrained existence, always looking over my shoulder, always dependent on someone who had already demonstrated her willingness to erase me when it served her purposes. But coming back to life would mean exposing Carmen's fraud, potentially destroying my family, and facing unknown consequences from authorities who would want to understand how such an elaborate deception had been maintained for years. The choice between invisibility and exposure, between safety and authenticity, between family loyalty and personal justice, would define everything that came next in my strange, impossible life. The decision to confront Elena came to me during a particularly sleepless night 3 weeks after my discovery at the DMV. I had been carrying the weight of this secret alone, and the isolation was becoming unbearable. If anyone in my family might have answers or at least share my confusion, it would be my sister who had lived through the supposed timeline of my death. I waited until Carmen left for work and chose a Saturday morning when Elena was home, nursing a hangover from a night out with Marcus. She was sprawled on the couch in our small living room, wearing yesterday's clothes and squinting at the morning light filtering through our thin curtains. "Elena," I said, settling into the chair across from her, "I need to ask you something really important, and I need you to be honest with me." She groaned and pulled a throw pillow over her face. "If this is about borrowing my black sweater again, the answer is still no. You never wash it properly. It's not about clothes, it's about me being dead." The pillow slipped from her hands, and she sat up abruptly, her bloodshot eyes suddenly alert and focused. The casual annoyance on her face transformed into something much more complex, a mixture of fear and resignation that told me everything I needed to know before she spoke a single word. "How did you find out?" she asked quietly, her voice lacking any of the confusion or shock that should have accompanied such an bizarre statement. My heart sank. The small part of me that had hoped this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, some bureaucratic error that could be easily corrected, died in that moment. Elena's response confirmed that my worst suspicions were true. She had known all along. "The DMV," I said, studying her face carefully. "They told me I was reported dead 3 years ago." "Elena, why didn't you ever tell me?" She ran her hands through her tangled hair, a nervous habit she had developed in childhood and never outgrown. "Because Mom made it very clear that if anyone found out we would all be in serious trouble. She said the government would take you away, that they would split up our family, that she could go to prison. But I'm your sister, how could you just let me live thinking everything was normal when I was supposedly dead?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since we were children, I saw her as vulnerable rather than rebellious. "You were so young when it happened, Isabella. Mom said it was temporary, just until she could figure out how to fix the financial problems we were having." She said it would only be for a few months. 3 years, Elena. It's been 3 years. I know, she whispered. I've been wanting to tell you, especially as you got older and started talking about college and jobs and a driver's license. But every time I tried to bring it up with Mom, she would get this look in her eyes, this coldness that scared me more than her anger ever did. I felt a strange mixture of relief and betrayal. Relief that I wasn't completely alone in this knowledge, but betrayal that my own sister had watched me live a lie for years without saying anything. Tell me everything you know, from the beginning. Elena looked toward the front door, as if Carmen might walk through it at any moment and catch us having this conversation. Then she took a deep breath and began to unravel the story I had been desperate to understand. It started with Dad, she said, and I felt my chest tighten. Carmen rarely spoke about my father, and when she did, it was only to mention his abandonment and failure to provide support. He didn't just disappear, Isabella, he died. The room seemed to spin slightly. What do you mean he died? Mom always said he left us. He was killed in a motorcycle accident when you were 13, but here's the thing, he had been paying child support regularly up until his death. Substantial child support, because he had a good job at an engineering firm, and the court had ordered him to pay based on his actual income, not some reduced amount. I tried to process this information. If my father had died when I was 13, that would place his death right around the time I was supposedly killed in a car accident. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. When someone who owes child support dies, Elena continued, the payments usually stop unless there are specific provisions in place, like life insurance policies or estate arrangements. Dad didn't have those kinds of protections set up. Mom was facing the loss of several $100s every month, money she had been counting on to pay rent and basic expenses. So she decided to kill me instead, I said, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. Not you specifically. She could have chosen any of us, but Miguel had already turned 18 and aged out of the system, and I was close to 18. You were the youngest, which meant the payments would continue the longest if something happened to you instead of to Dad. The calculated nature of this decision was breathtaking. Carmen had essentially performed a cost-benefit analysis and determined that my legal death was more financially advantageous than my father's actual death. She had swapped one tragedy for another, trading reality for a more profitable fiction. How did she do it? How do you just report someone dead when they're obviously alive? Elena shifted uncomfortably on the couch. Mom had worked in medical billing for years. She understood how the system worked, what documentation was required, who had access to what information. She also knew that when it comes to family tragedies, people generally don't ask too many questions if the paperwork looks legitimate. She explained that Carmen had reported me as a victim of a car accident that supposedly occurred while I was visiting relatives in another state. She had created fake medical records, forged death certificates, and submitted all the necessary paperwork to redirect the child support payments from survivor benefits for my father's death to survivor benefits for my death. But I was obviously still alive. How did she explain my presence in the house? That's where it gets really complicated, Elena said. Mom told the neighbors and anyone who asked that you had gone to live with relatives after Dad's death, that the family trauma was too much for you to handle and you needed a change of environment. To most of the outside world, you did disappear. I thought about our living situation over the past 3 years, how Carmen had become increasingly protective of my schedule and social activities. She had gradually isolated me from neighborhood friendships, discouraged me from participating in activities that might bring outside attention to our household, and carefully managed my interactions with anyone who might have known me before my supposed death. What about school? How do you enroll a dead person in high school? Mom moved us to a different district, Elena explained. She used false documents to enroll you under a slightly different name variation, Isabella Marie instead of Isabella Rosa, with a social security number that belonged to a distant cousin who had died as an infant years ago. The school systems don't always cross-reference thoroughly, especially for families that appear to have legitimate documentation. The complexity of what Carmen had accomplished was staggering. She had essentially created a parallel identity for me, one that could function in daily life while my official identity remained buried in government databases. It required careful planning, detailed knowledge of bureaucratic systems, and the ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously. Elena, this is insane. How has she gotten away with it for so long? Because it's almost impossible to detect unless someone specifically looks for it, she replied. Dead children don't usually apply for driver's licenses or social security cards. And the agencies that process survivor benefits aren't typically in communication with the school systems or other institutions where you might appear in daily life. As Elena continued explaining the mechanics of Carmen's fraud, I began to understand the true scope of what had been done to me. I wasn't just legally dead, I was living under a false identity, enrolled in school under fraudulent documents, and dependent on a network of lies that could unravel at any moment. How much money is she getting? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elena hesitated. About $800 a month. It's supposed to continue until you turn 18, or in this case, until you would have turned 18 if you were still alive. $800 a month for 5 years represented $48,000. Carmen had essentially sold my legal existence for less than $50,000, spread out over time in monthly installments. The amount seemed simultaneously enormous and pathetically small. Elena, I have to fix this. I can't live like this anymore. I can't go to college, I can't get a real job, I can't have a normal life as long as I'm officially dead. She grabbed my hands, her grip desperate and frightening. Isabella, you can't. If you expose this, Mom will go to prison. They'll charge her with fraud, identity theft, probably a dozen other federal crimes. Our family will be destroyed. Our family is already destroyed, I said, though the words felt harsh even as I spoke them. I'm living a lie. You've been covering up a crime for 3 years, and Mom has been stealing money from the government while pretending to grieve for a daughter who's sitting right here. How is that not already destroyed? We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of the situation. Elena was crying quietly, and I felt the familiar weight of being the family problem solver, the one expected to smooth over conflicts and find solutions that kept everyone else comfortable. But this wasn't the kind of problem that could be solved with compromise or careful navigation. This was a situation that required fundamental change, regardless of who might be hurt in the process. There's something else you need to know, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel knows too. Mom told him before he left for the army. She wanted to make sure he understood why he couldn't list you as an emergency contact or include you in any of his military paperwork. The betrayal deepened. Both of my siblings had known about my legal death for years and had chosen to say nothing, leaving me to stumble through life unaware that my very existence was illegal. They had watched me make plans for a future that was impossible, dream about possibilities that were foreclosed, and struggle with limitations I didn't understand. Why didn't he say anything when he visits? He barely visits anymore, Elena pointed out. And when he does, it's always awkward. He feels guilty about the whole situation, but he's also scared. Military personnel can lose their security clearances over family members who are involved in federal crimes, even if they're not directly responsible. So Miguel had essentially abandoned the family to protect his own career, leaving Elena and me to navigate Carmen's deception alone. It was a practical decision that I could understand intellectually, but it still felt like another abandonment in a long series of betrayals. Elena, I need you to help me figure out how to come back to life. She looked at me with genuine terror. Isabella, I can't. If this comes out, I'm an accessory after the fact. I've known about a federal crime for 3 years and done nothing to report it. I could go to prison too. The conversation continued for hours, with Elena alternating between tearful apologies and desperate attempts to convince me that exposing the truth would destroy everyone I loved without actually improving my situation. She painted scenarios of foster care, family separation, financial ruin, and criminal prosecution that made continuing the deception seem like the lesser of many evils. But as the day wore on, I realized that her arguments, while emotionally compelling, were based on the assumption that my current existence was sustainable and acceptable. Living as a legally dead person might work for a 16-year-old who needed basic shelter and education, but it was completely incompatible with adult life. I couldn't apply to legitimate colleges without proper documentation. I couldn't get a legal job that would allow me to support myself independently. I couldn't open bank accounts, sign lease agreements, obtain credit, or engage in any of the financial activities that defined adult autonomy. I couldn't even get married legally, or have children whose births could be properly documented. Carmen's solution had trapped me in permanent childhood, dependent on her continued deception for every aspect of my existence. And as I approached my 18th birthday, the situation would only become more complicated and dangerous. What happens when I turn 18? I asked Elena. The survivor benefits stop then, right? What does Mom plan to do about me at that point? Elena's silence was more frightening than any answer she could have given. It was clear that Carmen had not shared her long-term plans, possibly because she hadn't developed any, or possibly because those plans were too disturbing for Elena to discuss. That evening, I confronted Carmen directly for the first time since discovering the truth. I waited until after dinner, when Elena had retreated to her room and we were alone in the kitchen. Carmen was washing dishes with her usual methodical efficiency, and I stood beside her, drying plates and gathering my courage. "Mom, I know I'm dead," I said simply, without preamble or explanation. Her hands stopped moving for just a moment, a plate suspended in soapy water, before she resumed washing as if I hadn't spoken. "I don't know what you mean by that, Isabella. You're obviously standing right here. I mean, I know about the death certificate. I know about the survivor benefits. I know about Dad actually dying instead of abandoning us. I know about the false identity you created for me." Carmen set down the plate she was holding and turned to face me fully. Her expression was completely calm, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. It was the look of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 3 years. "Who told you?" she asked. "Does it matter? The point is I know, and we need to figure out how to fix this." Carmen dried her hands on a kitchen towel, taking her time and seeming to consider her words carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and controlled, as if she were discussing household chores rather than federal fraud. "There's nothing to fix, Isabella. What I did to keep this family together, and ensure that you had a roof over your head and food on the table. Your father's death left us in an impossible financial situation, and I found a solution that worked. A solution that made me legally dead. A solution that kept you fed, clothed, housed and educated," she corrected. "You've never wanted for anything essential because of the choices I made." The casual way she discussed my erasure was chilling. There was no guilt, no apology, no acknowledgement that what she had done was fundamentally wrong. In her mind, she had made a practical decision that had served the family's needs, and my discomfort with the situation was secondary to those practical benefits. "Mom, I can't live like this. I need a legal identity. I need to be able to build a real life." "Your life is real," she said firmly. "You go to school, you have friends, you participate in activities. What more do you need?" "I need to be able to go to college. I need to be able to get a job. I need to be able to exist as an adult in the world." Carmen's expression hardened. "Those are luxuries, Isabella. When I was your age, I didn't have the opportunities you have. I didn't get to worry about college or career planning because I was focused on survival. But I'm not you, Mom, and I shouldn't have to give up my future because you decided to commit fraud instead of finding a legal way to handle Dad's death." The word fraud seemed to strike her like a physical blow. Her composure cracked slightly, and I saw a flash of the fear and desperation that must have motivated her original decision. "Don't you dare judge me," she said, her voice rising. "I did what I had to do to protect this family. Do you think I wanted to make those choices? Do you think it was easy to watch you grow up knowing what I had done? Then why didn't you find a way to fix it? Why did you let it go on for 3 years? Because fixing it would have meant admitting what I did, and admitting what I did would have meant going to prison and leaving you children completely alone. At least this way, you had a mother who could take care of you." The conversation continued late into the night, with Carmen alternating between justifications and threats, between appeals to family loyalty and warnings about the consequences of exposure. She painted vivid pictures of what would happen if the truth came out, describing investigations, prosecutions, and family destruction in detail that suggested she had thought about these scenarios extensively. But she also revealed, perhaps inadvertently, that she had no real plan for my future beyond maintaining the current deception indefinitely. In her mind, I would simply continue living as a ghost, dependent on her protection and increasingly isolated from the legitimate world. As I lay in bed that night, processing everything I had learned from Elena and Carmen, I realized that I was facing the most important decision of my life. I could accept my status as a legally dead person and try to build some kind of constrained existence within the limitations that imposed. Or I could find a way to resurrect myself, regardless of the consequences for my family. The choice would define not just my immediate future, but my entire identity as a person. Would I be someone who accepted injustice for the sake of family peace, or someone who fought for truth and authenticity regardless of the personal cost? The answer, when it came to me in the early hours of the morning, was both terrifying and liberating. I was going to come back from the dead, and I was going to do it on my own terms, with or without my family's support. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to act in a way that would give me the best chance of success, while minimizing the damage to the people I still loved, despite everything they had done. My resurrection began with a phone call to my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, on a Tuesday morning in late October. I had spent weeks researching the legal process for correcting death records, and understood that I would need credible witnesses to verify my continued existence, along with documentation that could prove the original death report was fraudulent. Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to me, and she was one of the few adults outside my family who had consistent contact with me over the past 3 years. When I explained my situation during our meeting that afternoon, her initial response was disbelief, followed by genuine concern for my safety and well-being. "Isabella, these are very serious allegations," she said, leaning forward across her desk. "If what you're telling me is true, this involves multiple federal crimes. Are you certain you want to pursue this course of action?" I had anticipated this question and had prepared my answer carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't build a real life while I'm legally dead. I can't apply to colleges, I can't get legitimate employment, I can't even get a driver's license. I understand the consequences might be severe for my family, but I can't sacrifice my entire future to protect their secrets." She agreed to serve as a witness, and to provide documentation of my enrollment and attendance at the school, under what we now knew was a false identity. More importantly, she connected me with a legal aid attorney, who specialized in cases involving identity fraud and family exploitation. Attorney Jennifer Walsh was a woman in her early 40s who had built her career helping people navigate complex bureaucratic situations involving identification and documentation problems. When I met with her the following week, she listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had encountered similar cases before. "Cases like yours are more common than people realize," she told me. "Usually it involves parents hiding children from abusive former partners or families trying to maintain government benefits they're not entitled to. The difference in your situation is the sophistication of the deception and the length of time it's been maintained." Walsh explained that correcting my legal status would require filing formal complaints with multiple agencies, including the Social Security Administration, the State Vital Records Office, and potentially the FBI if federal fraud charges were pursued. The process could take months, or even years, and there was no guarantee that the resolution would be entirely favorable to me. "Your mother will almost certainly face criminal charges," she warned. "The amount of money involved and the duration of the fraud make this a serious felony case. You need to be prepared for the possibility that she could receive a substantial prison sentence." The weight of that potential outcome pressed down on me like a physical burden. Despite everything Carmen had done, despite the years of deception and the theft of my identity, she was still my mother. The thought of being responsible for sending her to prison was agonizing, but the alternative was accepting a lifetime of invisibility and dependence. Mrs. Walsh also explained that my siblings could potentially face charges as accessories to the fraud, since they had knowledge of the crime and failed to report it. Elena's fears about going to prison were not unfounded, though Miss Walsh believed that cooperative witnesses who helped expose the fraud might receive more lenient treatment. "The most important thing," she emphasized, "is that you understand this decision is irreversible. Once we file these complaints and begin the legal process, there's no going back to the way things were. Your family relationships will be permanently altered, and your mother will face serious legal consequences." I took a week to consider her warning, during which I experienced the most intense internal conflict of my life. Every logical argument supported moving forward with the legal process, but the emotional cost felt overwhelming. I was essentially choosing between my future and my family, between authenticity and loyalty, between justice and mercy. During this period of deliberation, I had several more conversations with Elena, hoping to convince her to support my decision or at least understand it. These discussions became increasingly heated as she realized I was serious about exposing Carmen's fraud. "You're going to destroy our family over something that doesn't even affect you that much," she argued during one particularly difficult conversation. "You have a home, you're getting an education, you have everything you need. Why isn't that enough?" "Because I'm not really living, Elena. I'm existing in a bubble that could pop at any moment. What happens when I graduate from high school? What happens when I want to get married or have children? What happens when Carmen decides she doesn't want to maintain this deception anymore? Mom would never abandon you. She's done everything to protect this family. She's done everything to protect herself," I corrected. If she really wanted to protect the family, she would have found a legal way to handle Dad's death instead of erasing one of her children. The breaking point came when I discovered that Carmen had already begun making plans for my 18th birthday that confirmed my worst fears about her long-term intentions. I found the documents while looking for tax forms Carmen had asked me to retrieve from her filing cabinet, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. Carmen had researched the process for obtaining a legal death certificate for someone who had supposedly died as a minor, but whose body was never recovered. She was planning to have me officially declared dead through the court system, which would make my resurrection legally impossible and permanently cement my non-existence. The timeline she had outlined suggested she intended to complete this process shortly after my 18th birthday, at which point the survivor benefits would end naturally, and my continued presence in the household would become a liability rather than a necessity. She was planning to erase me completely, making it impossible for me to ever reclaim my legal identity. When I confronted her with these documents, Carmen didn't deny her intentions. Instead, she calmly explained her reasoning as if she were discussing plans for a family vacation. "Isabella, you can't live in limbo forever. At some point, this situation needs to be resolved one way or another. Having you officially declared dead provides closure and eliminates the risk of future complications. Complications like me wanting to have a life. Complications like investigations that could destroy this entire family," she replied sharply. "You seem to think this is all about you, but there are other people who depend on the stability we've created. Elena is planning to transfer to a 4-year university next year. She needs this family to remain intact. And what about what I need?" Carmen's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine regret. "What you need is to understand that sometimes individual desires have to be sacrificed for the greater good of the family. I made that sacrifice when your father died, and now it's your turn." The casual way she discussed permanently erasing my existence was the final confirmation that I couldn't resolve this situation through negotiation or compromise. Carmen had made her decision, and she viewed my legal death not as a temporary expedient, but as a permanent solution to her financial and personal problems. That night, I called Miss Walsh and told her I was ready to proceed with filing the necessary complaints to restore my legal existence. The relief I felt at making this decision was immediate and profound, as if I had been holding my breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. The legal process moved more quickly than I had expected. Within 2 weeks of filing the initial complaints, investigators from the Social Security Administration arrived at our apartment to interview family members and examine documents. Carmen maintained her composure during the initial questioning, sticking to carefully prepared answers that minimized her involvement and emphasized her role as a grieving mother who had simply been trying to provide for her children. But the investigators had done their homework. They had traced the fraudulent documents Carmen had created, identified the medical facilities where she had supposedly taken me after the fake accident, and discovered discrepancies in her story that made her deception obvious to anyone looking closely at the evidence. Elena cooperated fully with the investigation, providing testimony that corroborated my account of events and demonstrated that Carmen's fraud had been deliberate and sustained. Her cooperation earned her immunity from prosecution, but the cost to our relationship was severe. Carmen viewed Elena's testimony as the ultimate betrayal, and the coldness between them was painful to witness. Miguel was questioned during a brief leave from his military duties, and his testimony confirmed that he had been aware of the fraud but had chosen not to report it. His military superiors were notified of the investigation, though his cooperation with authorities helped minimize the impact on his career. The most difficult moment came when Carmen was formally arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including identity fraud, theft of government funds, and child endangerment. Watching my mother handcuffed and led away by federal agents was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, despite knowing that her arrest was necessary for my own liberation. Carmen's trial took place 8 months later, during which the full scope of her deception was laid out in court. The prosecution presented evidence of elaborate planning, sophisticated document forgery, and sustained deception that had defrauded the government of nearly $30,000 over 3 years. Her defense attorney argued that Carmen had acted out of desperation following her husband's death, that she had been overwhelmed by financial pressures and had made poor decisions in an attempt to keep her family together. They portrayed her as a struggling single mother who had made mistakes rather than a calculating criminal who had deliberately erased her own child. The judge was not sympathetic to these arguments. During sentencing, he noted that Carmen's fraud had not only stolen money from government programs designed to help genuinely bereaved families, but had also inflicted severe psychological harm on her own daughter by denying her the right to legal existence. Carmen was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the Social Security Administration, including interest and penalties that brought the total amount to nearly $50,000. Throughout the trial and sentencing, Carmen maintained that she had acted in her family's best interests and that my decision to expose her fraud was selfish and destructive. She refused to acknowledge that what she had done was fundamentally wrong, viewing herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of an elaborate criminal scheme. The process of legally restoring my existence took nearly 2 years and required extensive documentation from schools, medical providers, and other institutions that had interacted with me during my period of official death. I had to provide fingerprints, DNA samples, and testimony from multiple witnesses to prove that I was indeed the same person who had supposedly died in a car accident years earlier. During this period, I lived with Elena in a small apartment we rented together, supporting ourselves through part-time jobs and financial aid from legal assistance programs. The experience of rebuilding my life from scratch was both terrifying and exhilarating, as I learned to navigate basic adult responsibilities that most people take for granted. When my legal status was finally restored, I received a new Social Security card and birth certificate that felt like the most precious documents in the world. The simple act of applying for a driver's license with legitimate identification brought tears to my eyes, as it represented my re-entry into the world of officially existing people. I enrolled in community college the following semester, beginning the educational journey that had been delayed by years of legal limbo. While my path to higher education was longer and more complicated than I had originally planned, the experience of earning my place through my own efforts rather than through family connections or advantages felt deeply meaningful. Elena and I slowly rebuilt our relationship, though it was forever changed by the events we had lived through together. She struggled with guilt over her years of silence and complicity, while I worked to forgive her for choosing family loyalty over speaking up for what was right. Our bond was stronger in some ways, forged through shared trauma and mutual support during the most difficult period of our lives. Miguel maintained his distance from the family drama, focusing on his military career and rarely discussing the events that had torn our family apart. While I understood his need for self-protection, his emotional absence during the most challenging period of my life remained a source of sadness and disappointment. Carmen served 20 months in prison before being released on parole. Upon her release, she moved to another state and had minimal contact with any of her children. The woman who had once controlled every aspect of my existence became a distant figure who occasionally sent birthday cards, but never acknowledged the harm she had caused or expressed genuine remorse for her actions. The psychological healing from years of living as a legally dead person took much longer than the bureaucratic process of restoration. I spent years in therapy working through the complex trauma of having my existence erased by the person who should have protected me most fiercely. Learning to trust my own perceptions and rebuild my sense of self-worth was an ongoing process that continued long after my legal status was resolved. But there were also unexpected gifts that emerged from this experience. Having fought so hard to reclaim my right to exist, I developed an appreciation for basic freedoms and opportunities that most people never think about. The simple ability to sign a lease, open a bank account, or apply for a job felt like precious privileges rather than mundane adult responsibilities. More importantly, I discovered reserves of strength and determination that I never knew I possessed. The scared 16-year-old who had first learned of her legal death had transformed into a young woman capable of challenging powerful institutions and making difficult decisions that prioritized long-term authenticity over short-term family harmony. Today at 34, I work as an advocate for other people navigating identity fraud and documentation problems. My experience gives me unique insight into the bureaucratic challenges and emotional trauma that come with having your existence questioned or erased by official systems. I've helped dozens of people reclaim their identities, whether they were victims of family fraud like I was, or people whose documentation problems stemmed from other sources like immigration issues, adoption complications, or clerical errors. Each successful case feels like a small victory against the forces that would render people invisible. The relationship with my mother remains complicated and distant. Carmen has never fully acknowledged the wrongness of what she did, maintaining that she acted out of love and necessity rather than selfishness or criminal intent. While I've forgiven her for my own peace of mind, I've also accepted that we will never have the close relationship that many mothers and daughters enjoy. Looking back on those years of being legally dead while physically alive, I understand that my mother's fraud was about more than money. It was about control, about maintaining a version of family life that served her needs regardless of the cost to her children. In erasing my legal existence, she had attempted to make me permanently dependent on her protection and permanently invisible to the outside world. But by fighting to resurrect myself, I had claimed something that goes beyond legal documentation or government recognition. I had claimed the right to define my own existence, to make my own choices about my future, and to live authentically rather than in the shadow of someone else's deception. The young woman who stands here today, legally alive and building a life based on truth rather than fraud, is living proof that it's never too late to come back from the dead. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply insisting on your right to exist, even when the people who should support you have decided that your invisibility serves their purposes better than your presence. Your story might be different from mine, but if you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or rendered invisible by the people who should see you most clearly, remember that you have the power to resurrect yourself. It might cost you relationships, it might require difficult choices, but your right to exist authentically is worth fighting for, no matter how long the battle takes. 3 months ago, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my story. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Rebecca Martinez, a journalist investigating cases of identity fraud involving government benefits. She had been researching my mother's case for a book she was writing about family exploitation and had uncovered information that nobody, including me, had known during the original investigation. "Isabella," she said, her voice gentle but urgent. "I've been reviewing court documents and financial records from your mother's case, and I found something that I think you need to know. Your mother wasn't the only one involved in this scheme." My hands began to shake as I held the phone. After years of believing I understood the full scope of what had happened to me, the possibility that there were additional layers of deception felt overwhelming. Rebecca explained that she had traced financial records showing regular payments from Carmen to a man named David Ochoa, who worked as a clerk in the Vital Records office of our county. These payments, disguised as consulting fees for a fake business, had been made monthly for the entire duration of my legal death. "It appears your mother had inside help creating and maintaining the fraudulent death certificate," Rebecca continued. "Someone with access to official systems was being paid to ensure that the documentation looked legitimate, and that any inquiries were handled properly. The revelation that Carmen had not acted alone, that she had enlisted a corrupt government employee to help maintain my non-existence, added a new dimension to the betrayal I had experienced. It also explained how she had been able to maintain such sophisticated documentation for so many years without detection. David Ochoa was arrested 2 weeks later, and his cooperation with investigators revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. He had been running a side business helping people create false death certificates, fake birth records, and other fraudulent documents for clients willing to pay substantial fees. My mother had been just one of several customers in what amounted to an identity trafficking operation. During Ochoa's trial, additional victims came forward, including 2 other families where children had been declared dead to maintain benefit payments, and several cases involving people who wanted to disappear from creditors or legal obligations. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving dozens of false documents and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent claims. The discovery of this larger conspiracy provided some unexpected closure for me. Learning that my mother had been part of a broader criminal network rather than an isolated incident of desperation made her actions feel less personal, though no less harmful. She had not invented this scheme in a moment of grief-stricken panic. She had sought out and paid for professional criminal assistance. The additional investigation also resulted in Carmen's sentence being extended by another year, as prosecutors filed additional charges related to her participation in Ochoa's identity trafficking ring. She would now serve a total of 4 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. More importantly for me, the discovery of the broader conspiracy led to policy changes in how vital records are processed and verified. The state implemented new security measures and cross-reference systems designed to prevent the kind of fraud that had erased my existence. Knowing that my experience had contributed to protections for future potential victims gave meaning to the suffering I had endured. The renewed media attention surrounding Ochoa's arrest and the exposure of the identity trafficking ring brought unexpected opportunities into my life. Several advocacy organizations reached out to offer me speaking engagements and consulting opportunities, recognizing that my experience provided valuable insights into how these systems could be exploited and improved. I began traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing my story with government employees, social workers, and legal professionals who worked with identity documentation. Speaking publicly about my experience was initially terrifying, as it required reliving traumatic memories in front of strangers, but it also felt empowering to transform my victimization into education and advocacy. During one of these speaking engagements, I met Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher studying the psychological impact of identity erasure and family exploitation. She invited me to participate in a study examining the long-term effects of having one's legal existence denied or manipulated by family members. Working with Dr. Chen's research team helped me understand that my experience, while extreme, was part of a broader pattern of family abuse that often goes unrecognized. Many people experience forms of identity control or erasure that don't rise to the level of legal death, but still profoundly impact their ability to develop autonomy and self-determination. Through this research, I connected with other survivors of family exploitation who had experienced different but related forms of identity manipulation. Some had been hidden from educational systems to avoid scrutiny of family situations. Others had been prevented from obtaining identification documents to maintain dependence on controlling family members. A few had been given false names or birth dates to conceal their true ages or origins. These connections helped me realize that my story was not just about one woman's extreme response to financial pressure, but about broader patterns of how families can use identity and documentation as tools of control. Understanding this larger context helped reduce the isolation and shame I had carried for years. The most significant development came 18 months ago when I was offered a position with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, working specifically with cases involving family abduction and identity concealment. The job combined my personal experience with formal training in investigation and victim advocacy, allowing me to help other people who had been erased or hidden by their own families. In this role, I work with law enforcement agencies, social services, and legal professionals to identify and recover children whose existences have been concealed or manipulated by family members. The cases vary widely, from parents hiding children from custody orders to elaborate schemes involving false documentation and identity theft. Each successful recovery feels like a victory not just for the individual child or family involved, but for the principle that every person has the right to legal recognition and authentic existence. When I help a teenager discover their real name and birth date, or assist a young adult in obtaining legitimate identification after years of living with false documents, I'm reminded of my own journey from legal death to authenticated life. The work is emotionally challenging, as it requires confronting the reality that families, the institutions we expect to provide protection and support, can become sources of exploitation and harm. But it's also deeply meaningful, as it represents the transformation of my own trauma into a tool for protecting others. Last year, I testified before a congressional subcommittee examining gaps in identity verification systems that allow fraudulent documents to go undetected. The experience of sitting in a government building, speaking as an expert rather than a victim, representing not just my own experience but the experiences of other survivors, felt like the ultimate reclamation of the voice that had been silenced for so many years. My relationship with Elena has continued to evolve and strengthen over the years. She completed her education and now works as a social worker specializing in family crisis intervention. We often discuss how our shared experience of surviving Carmen's deception shaped our career choices and our commitment to protecting vulnerable people from family exploitation. Elena recently became engaged to a man who knows our full family history and has embraced the complexity of our past without judgment. Watching her build a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, after growing up in a household built on deception and control, feels like evidence that it's possible to create authentic connections even after experiencing profound betrayal. Miguel retired from the military last year and has begun reaching out more frequently, expressing regret about his emotional absence during the most difficult periods of our family crisis. While our relationship remains somewhat distant, his efforts to reconnect and his acknowledgement of the choices he made represent progress toward healing that I hadn't expected. Carmen was released from prison 6 months ago and has made several attempts to contact me through intermediaries. She claims to want reconciliation and has expressed what she describes as remorse for the pain she caused. However, her version of remorse continues to focus on the unintended consequences of her actions rather than acknowledgement of the fundamental wrongness of erasing her own child. I have chosen not to respond to these overtures, not out of vindictiveness, but because I have learned to prioritize my own emotional well-being over family expectations of forgiveness and reconciliation. The relationship with my mother may never be repaired, and I have made peace with that reality. The young woman who discovered her own death at the DMV counter 15 years ago has become someone I could never have imagined in those early days of confusion and fear. I have a career that gives meaning to my experience, relationships built on truth rather than deception, and most importantly, legal documentation that confirms my right to exist in the world. Sometimes people ask me if I regret exposing my mother's fraud, if I wish I had found a way to preserve family relationships while still reclaiming my identity. The answer is complicated, because the cost of authenticity was indeed high, measured in broken relationships and years of legal battles and emotional healing. But living as a ghost in my own life was never a sustainable option. The teenager who accepted her non-existence to preserve family harmony would have become an adult trapped by that same silence, unable to build genuine relationships or pursue meaningful goals, because her very existence was built on lies. The path from legal death to authentic life required courage I didn't know I possessed, support from people I had never met, and a willingness to prioritize long-term truth over short-term peace. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and it was absolutely necessary. For anyone watching this who feels erased, overlooked, or trapped by family dynamics that deny your right to exist authentically, remember that you have more power than you realize. The systems that seem designed to keep you invisible can be challenged. The relationships that require your silence can be renegotiated or ended. The future that seems impossible can be claimed through persistence and courage. Your story belongs to you, not to the people who would prefer you to remain quiet, grateful, and invisible. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the simple radical act of insisting on your right to be seen, to be heard, and to exist on your own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.